Pick that up, sweetheart, assuming you last the week, which I doubt. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 hours before 200 Special Forces operators walked through his hospital doors. Seattle General in Philadelphia smells like antiseptic and floor wax, fluorescent lights humming over linoleum worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Margaret Walsh moves through the ICU with meticulous efficiency, her wrinkled scrubs 2 sizes too large, grey hair pulled into a severe bun that hides the scar running behind her left ear. The scar tissue is pale, almost silver, a thin line that traces from her temple to the base of her skull, a souvenir from Bagram that no amount of concealer could cover, so she simply kept her hair down and her head level. She keeps a pair of worn combat boots in her locker, leather cracked and stained dark along the soles, checking them each shift before closing the metal door without explanation or pause. The boots smell like dust and memory, like deserts that have no names on any map. Her hands never shake when she draws blood or adjusts full lines, muscle memory so precise it unnerves the younger nurses who fumble with catheters and whisper about why she doesn't smile. Margaret draws a 22-gauge needle with the fluid certainty of someone who has done this 8,000 times, who has done it in darkness, in blood, in conditions that would make most people weep. She moves like someone carrying a weight that can't be put down, shoulders squared, spine straight, the kind of posture that comes from surviving things that break other people. The nurses call her the ghost behind her back, not because she's invisible but because she's present without being seen, competent without being noticed, essential without demanding recognition. In room 347, Sergeant Reeves stares at the ceiling with TBI-clouded eyes, his gaze unfocused and distant, traveling through memories that no longer connect to the present moment. He wears a hospital gown and the 1,000-yard stare of a man whose mind has been shattered and poorly reassembled. His left forearm is wrapped in bandages that conceal a tattoo he doesn't remember getting, a name in script, faded and old, the letters slightly blurred as if done in haste or in darkness. Margaret checks his vitals without speaking, her face betraying nothing when his gaze passes over her like she's furniture, like she's part of the hospital's infrastructure, a monitor or a bed rail. She notes his blood pressure, 118/76, stable, and adjusts the flow rate on his forearm with 2 fingers, a micro-movement of precision. Her lips press into a thin line, the only visible sign that anything is happening behind her carefully constructed neutrality. Sergeant Reeves does not recognize her. She does not expect him to. Dr. Whitfield watches from the nurse's station, his posture radiating the kind of authority that comes from a medical degree and a family trust fund, tapping his Mont Blanc pen against a clipboard with rhythmic precision. He is tall in the way wealthy men are tall, not through genetics but through the confidence of never having been told no, suit tailored to cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, the kind of watch that announces itself on his wrist like a trophy. His jaw tightens as he reviews her charting, each note written in Margaret's precise hand, each medication cross-referenced against the physician's desk reference, every dosage questioned, every billing code flagged with a small asterisk that screamed something is wrong here. Margaret's charting is a problem for Dr. Whitfield. It is a beautiful, meticulous, documented problem. For 17 months, he has been running an arrangement with 3 pharmaceutical representatives from Bennett Pharmaceuticals, adjusted orders for cardiac medications that are never fully administered, the excess going directly to his private clinic uptown where he bills insurance companies at triple rates. The scheme has generated $847,000 in unmarked payments to an offshore account in the Caymans, money that is supposed to remain invisible, protected by the assumption that no one would actually read the charts carefully enough to notice that the ordered doses don't match the documented administered amounts. No one reads charts that carefully. Except Margaret Walsh reads charts that carefully. Margaret reads charts the way a theologian reads scripture, searching for truth in every word, every number, every notation. She has questioned 4 of his orders in the past 2 weeks alone, sending them back through pharmacy review with polite notes that translated to, "This doesn't add up." Her questions are killing his income stream at a rate of approximately $14,000 per week. She is costing him money with nothing more than meticulous attention to detail and a refusal to look the other way. He doesn't know who she is. He doesn't know that she has operated in 6 countries under 4 different names. He doesn't know that her hands have held more lives together than most surgeons, that she can perform emergency pericardiocentesis in the dark using only touch and muscle memory, that she has survived things that have nothing to do with a quiet woman pushing a med cart through his hospital. What Dr. Whitfield knows is that she is a threat to his carefully constructed kingdom, and threats must be neutralized with the precision of a man who has spent his entire life getting exactly what he wanted. The morning rounds begin at 7:27 a.m., the medical team assembling in room 301 like soldiers at morning briefing, resident physicians in their white coats holding tablets, nurses trailing behind, Margaret stationed in the corner as she always is, present but not present, visible but overlooked. Dr. Whitfield moves through the rooms with theatrical precision, his voice carrying the weight of authority, his presence making the fluorescent lights seem dimmer by comparison. He reviews lab values with a confidence that borders on arrogance, making decisions with the kind of casual certainty that comes from never having been questioned. Margaret stands 3 feet behind the group, reading vitals on the monitor, noting that Mrs. Chen in 301 has a slightly elevated temperature and a heart rate creeping toward tachycardia, subtle signs that someone should probably check for signs of infection. She does not speak. Speaking would be noticed. Speaking would confirm her presence in a way that she has spent 17 months avoiding. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part comes at 12:14 p.m. in the cafeteria, during the Tuesday lunch rush when the space is crowded with surgical residents and attending physicians and nurses grabbing 30-minute reprieves from the machines keeping people alive. Margaret stands in line with a plastic tray, collecting a salad and a container of low-sodium soup, moving with the same invisible efficiency she brings to everything. She wears the same wrinkled scrubs as always, the same worn badge clipped to her waistband, the same combat boots polished but cracked at the edges. She is not looking for attention. She is not prepared for it. Dr. Whitfield sees her at the table with 3 surgical residents, young men in their second year of residency, hungry and loud and laughing about a case from the morning. He sets his own tray down at the edge of their table and then, with a fluid and deliberate motion, reaches across and knocks Margaret's tray sideways onto the tile floor. The salad spills across her lap. The soup container rolls beneath the nearest table. The plastic tray clatters with a sound that makes everyone stop talking. "Careful there," he says, his voice carrying across the sudden silence like a command, like something practiced and rehearsed, like something he has done before to other people who could not fight back. "Wouldn't want you to make a mess." The surgical residents freeze, their forks hovering above their plates, their faces carefully arranged into expressions of neutrality that scream they know this is wrong and will not interfere. The room's acoustics have shifted, the fluorescent lights above seem louder somehow, their hum more aggressive, more present. Margaret stands without speaking, collecting the pieces of her tray with movements so controlled they appear mechanical. Her jaw clenches for exactly 1 second, the only visible response, the only signal that anything has moved behind her carefully constructed composure. She bends at the knees, not the waist, and begins gathering her lunch from the floor. She does not look at Dr. Whitfield. She does not acknowledge the residents staring at their food. She moves through the space with the efficiency of someone who has cleaned worse from worse places, and that efficiency is somehow more dignified than any response she could offer. But Dr. Whitfield is not finished. He is never finished when he has an audience. He walks back to the resident's table and drops her patient charts onto her chair with a theatrical flourish, the paper scattering across the floor in a deliberate cascade, his worn blank pen clattering across the tile. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he says, his voice pitched to Carrie, "assuming you last a week, which I doubt." He smiles at the residents, waiting for their laugh, and they deliver it on cue, a nervous laughter, the kind that nervous men produce when a powerful person has made something into a joke. Margaret continues cleaning her lunch without pause. She collects the scattered patient charts without folding them neatly, holding them against her chest with one hand while wiping her wet scrubs with paper towels. The charts are from rooms 312, 318, and 347. The last one, room 347, is Sergeant Danny Reeves's file, and it is open to a page of her notes that document, in meticulous detail, every inconsistency in his medication orders, every dose that doesn't reconcile with the amount supposedly dispensed, every question that adds up to a very specific and very damaging truth. She does not say anything. She has learned, across 19 years of service and 6 years of hiding, that silence is more powerful than any response, that restraint is the only weapon that does not require her hands to touch anything. She deposits her lunch debris in the trash and walks back toward the ICU with the patient charts held against her chest, the room already turning back to its normal noise, the moment already dissolving into the kind of forgetting that powerful people rely on. What the residents do not know is that 3 of them have just witnessed the moment when Dr. Whitfield signed his own termination. What they do not know is that Margaret Walsh has been documenting every medication discrepancy, every billing inconsistency, every moment of public humiliation with the same meticulous precision that she brings to everything. What they do not know is that somewhere in a secure digital file stored on a password-protected server, there is a paper trail that adds up to $847,000, and that paper trail is about to walk itself directly to the FBI. But Margaret does not know that yet either. She knows only that she has survived worse humiliations than being knocked around in front of junior doctors, that she has learned not to respond to insults from men who have never faced actual consequences, and that she still has 2 more hours on her shift before she can return to room 347 and check on Sergeant Reeves's vitals. She knows that his blood pressure will be 118/76, stable, unchanged, the same as it was this morning, the same as it was yesterday. She knows that he will not recognize her, that he will never recognize her, that the name tattooed on his arm will remain a mystery to him for as long as he lives in this broken state. She does not know, as she walks back through the ICU and begins reviewing the evening medication orders, that everything is about to change. Her breaks became a ritual. 15 minutes, sometimes 20 if the charge nurse wasn't watching, Margaret would slip into room 347 and sit in the visitor's chair beside Sergeant Danny Reeves's bed. The machines around him kept their mechanical rhythm, ventilator wheeze, heart monitor beep, for pump clicking through its cycles. She never spoke. Words belonged to people with names that meant something. She only sat, hands folded in her lap, watching his eyes track nothing at all. Reeves's TBI had hollowed him out from the inside. The blast that took his memory had left behind a shell that could breathe and blink and occasionally move his fingers, but the thing that made him Reeves, the guy who'd quoted Hemingway in Kandahar, who'd taught medic refresher courses, who'd covered her back through 3 kilometers of open terrain, that thing was gone. His eyes passed over her face the same way they passed over the ceiling tiles and the fluorescent lights and the forestand. Recognition never came. The name tattooed on his left forearm in fading black ink meant nothing to him anymore. Margaret. Just a word. Just a sound that didn't reach whatever part of him was still alive somewhere behind that blank stare. She'd check his chart without reading it, her fingers tracing the lines of vital signs, the medication orders, the notes from the day shift. Her eyes moved with precision, the same precision she brought to everything now. The precision of someone trained to notice what others missed. What she found made her chest tighten. The oxycodone orders were inconsistent with his pain management protocol. Not slightly off. Significantly off. Orders that matched the pharmaceutical rep's delivery schedules more closely than they matched Reeves's actual clinical need. She knew what that meant. She'd seen it in Bagram, seen it in the small corruptions that compound into larger ones, seen how good intentions and financial pressure and the slow grinding exhaustion of serving in a system that didn't always serve you back could bend someone into something unrecognizable. Dr. Whitfield had bent himself into a lot of unrecognizable shapes. That was when she noticed him watching. Tuesday afternoon, during rounds. Dr. Whitfield stood in the doorway of room 347, observing her sit beside Reeves's bed, observing the way her hand rested on the metal rail of his mattress, observing the absolute stillness of her face as she stared at a man who would never know her. His expression shifted, not surprise, something sharper. Recognition. He saw what was happening. He saw that she cared. And in Dr. Whitfield's calculations, caring was weakness. Leverage. That evening, the cafeteria was crowded with the Tuesday dinner crowd. Residents clustered around tables near the windows, their laughter loud and easy, the sound of people who hadn't yet learned what it meant to lose. Margaret sat alone in the corner with a bowl of soup and saltine crackers, her hospital badge turned backward, eating mechanically because the body required fuel. She wasn't thinking about anything in particular. She was just existing. Just moving through the hours until the shift ended. Dr. Whitfield approached from behind. She didn't hear him coming, she heard him announcing himself. Well, if it isn't our meticulous little mystery nurse. Loud enough for 3 tables to hear. Loud enough to be a performance. Margaret's hand stilled. The spoon hung halfway to her mouth. You know what I admire? His voice had taken on that theatrical quality she'd learned to recognize, the tone he used when he wanted witnesses. Your dedication. Sitting with that vegetable every break. Very touching. He was moving closer. She could smell his cologne, expensive, aggressive, like everything else about him. Must be difficult. Watching someone you care about just disappear. Her jaw clenched. Not visible to anyone watching. Just the muscles tightening for a single breath. Tell you what. His hand came into view, hovering over her tray. Let me help with that. He swept his hand across the bowl. Soup erupted across the linoleum, splashing her scrubs, dripping onto her hands. The crash of the ceramic bowl against the tile was louder than it should have been. Every resident at the nearby tables turned to look. Oops, Dr. Whitfield said. Butterfingers. Margaret set down her spoon slowly. Deliberately. She reached for napkins from the dispenser on the table, white paper, industrial rough texture, the kind that didn't absorb anything well. She began cleaning the mess. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her face showed nothing at all. Clean that up, would you? His voice was still performing. Still for the audience. Assuming you know how. 2 residents laughed nervously. The kind of laughter that came from not knowing what else to do, the sound of people recognizing cruelty but not wanting to be next. Margaret wiped the table. Wiped her scrubs. Disposed of the sodden napkins. When it was done, she stood, her posture impeccable, her eyes forward. Good girl, Whitfield said, and turned away, his audience satisfied. She didn't go back to lunch. She went back to work. During afternoon rounds, he dropped her. The stack of patient charts, 15, maybe 20, he simply released them from waist height while she was standing nearby, and they scattered across the corridor like broken birds. Papers everywhere. Lab results, vital sign sheets, medication reconciliations, all of it required careful ordering, careful tracking. Margaret, or whatever your real name is, pick those up. He said it with a surgical team clustered around him, residents and interns learning what medicine looked like at this hospital. Learning what they should tolerate. What they should become. You do know your alphabet, right? Or should I find someone competent? She knelt slowly. Her left knee caught slightly, old injury, old pain, but her hands moved with automatic efficiency. Gathering. Ordering. Checking each sheet to ensure nothing was lost, nothing mixed into the wrong patient's chart. She could feel their eyes on her. The residents. The interns. The weight of being watched while on your knees in the middle of a hospital corridor. Nobody helped. That was part of the lesson too. When it was done, she stood, the stack of charts pressed against her chest. She'd arranged them perfectly. In order. Ready to use. Thank you, Whitfield said, and there was something reptilian in his smile. That night, at the nurse's station, he leaned close enough she could smell his coffee breath, the bitterness of it mixing with the antiseptic smell that never quite left your nostrils after 12 hours in a hospital. I give you 3 days before you quit, he said quietly, just for her. Just for the person he thought he was breaking. Want to make it interesting? $100 says you don't last the week, Ghost. The nickname stuck. Ghost. Because she moved quietly. Because she appeared and disappeared without notice. Because she seemed to have no substance, no presence, no weight in the world. He started using it constantly. Hey Ghost, room 512 needs a bedpan. Ghost, you missed a spot on the instrument tray. Our little Ghost doesn't talk much, does she? What's wrong, Ghost? Cat got your tongue. The resident started using it too. Margaret continued charting as if he hadn't spoken. continued moving through her shift as if the words were just noise in a building full of noise. But alone in the supply closet during her 2 a.m. break, she gripped the metal shelf until her knuckles went white, the old bullet wound in her left shoulder throbbing in rhythm with her heartbeat, pain like an old memory that wouldn't stay buried. She was reviewing medication orders when she noticed the discrepancy. 2:16 a.m., the ICU quiet except for the machines. Sergeant Reeves's chart showed an oxycodone order that didn't match his clinical need, didn't match his pain assessment, didn't match anything except the pharmaceutical delivery schedule she'd memorized watching invoices cross the nursing station. She photographed the order with her phone, careful, methodical, the way she'd been trained to document evidence. Then she notified the charge nurse. Then she filled out an incident report. Paper trail. Documentation. The kind of meticulous charting that couldn't be ignored. The next morning, Dr. Whitfield called her into his office. Not asked. Called. His expression had changed. The arrogant contempt was still there, but underneath it was something harder. Something threatened. Your incident report, he said, not offering her a seat. Regarding medication orders. The protocol didn't match. I didn't ask you to question the protocol. His voice dropped. I asked you why you felt the need to document your concerns instead of coming to me directly. It required documentation. No. He stood. His desk was mahogany, expensive, the kind of furniture that announced how much he'd succeeded. What it required was discretion. Professional discretion. Which you seemed to lack. He turned to face the window, the city of Philadelphia spread below him like something he'd purchased. You're being reassigned, effective tomorrow night. Graveyard shift. West Wing. 4th floor. You'll be covering the medical ward. Dementia, post-stroke, end of life. No ICU. No contact with intensive care cases. The message was clear. Away from Reeves. Away from the evidence she was gathering. Away from witnesses. Isolated on the lowest status ward, working overnight when nobody important was watching, where her charting would be reviewed by minimal staff and where her concerns would be treated as the neurotic worries of someone too burnt out to think clearly. Is that a problem, Ghost? He asked, and his smile was a knife showing its edge. Margaret's hands remained still at her sides. Her voice, when she spoke, came out perfectly level. No problem, doctor. She left his office and didn't return to the ICU. The next night she was in the West Wing, pushing a medication cart through dimly lit hallways where the only sounds were the occasional call bell and the labored breathing of people waiting for the end to arrive. Room 347 was for floors above her. The machine she'd come to know through constant vigil, the ventilator, the monitor, the 4-pump, would continue their rhythm without her, their patient tended by residents who barely looked at him and nurses who'd never heard his name when it meant something, who'd never carried him 3 kilometers through Taliban fire, who'd never known the exact weight of a human body in your arms when you're moving through darkness that wants to kill you. She worked through the night. She documented everything. She photographed every medication order. She built her paper trail with the precision of someone assembling evidence for a court-martial, because evidence was the only language that worked when you were standing on the wrong side of power. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was 2:24 a.m. on Thursday when the code blue alarm sounded from 4 floors up, when she heard through the paging system that Sergeant Reeves was crashing with cardiac tamponade, when she understood with absolute clarity that everything was about to change. The code blue alarm screamed at 2:27 a.m. on Thursday, a sound that lived in Margaret's bones long before it reached her ears. She was standing in the graveyard shift break room, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, when the paging system crackled, code blue, ICU, room 347. Repeat, code blue, ICU, room 347. Sergeant Reeves. The coffee cup hit the tile floor. It didn't shatter. It rolled. 4 floors. Stairwell or elevator would add 45 seconds. Margaret moved like muscle memory had a voice, her legs already carrying her toward the emergency stairs before her mind caught up. The door swung open with a pneumatic hiss. 28 steps to the 4th floor. She counted them without thinking. Her thighs burned. Her lungs stayed steady. The ICU doors burst open at 2:51 a.m., for minutes from collapse, and the room was already chaos, controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless. The trauma team was there. 2 residents. 1 attending physician who wasn't Dr. Whitfield, thank God. The cardiac monitor displayed a rhythm that made Margaret's stomach drop. The fluid around Sergeant Reeves's heart was crushing it, tamponade in its truest and cruelest form. His blood pressure was 62/40. Oxygen saturation dropping like an anchor, 91, 88, 84. The ICU nurse, Jenkins, Margaret's age, competent but frozen, stood holding an 4-line that wasn't doing anything useful against a heart being strangled by its own fluids. Pericardiocentesis, the attending said, not shouted. That was how you knew it was serious. No volume. Just precision. Get me an 18-gauge needle, 10 cubic centimeters syringe, 1% lidocaine, and a cardiac monitor. Now. His voice came out flat as a scalpel. Margaret's hands moved before the words finished. She was already turning toward the crash cart, already moving with the rhythm of 1,000 drills and 3 tours of Bagram where you learned the difference between speed and panic. Speed saved lives. Panic got people killed. The needle was in her hand. The syringe. The cardiac ultrasound machine was being wheeled in by a tech whose name Margaret didn't know, but whose hand shook as he positioned the probe. Through the ultrasound window, the fluid around Reeves's heart looked like a black lake drowning him from inside. The attending physician's face didn't change. He'd seen this before. So had Margaret. She'd seen it in a field hospital outside Kandahar where the patient was a 19-year-old kid from Kentucky whose chest had been crushed by an IED. That one hadn't made it. This one would. Margaret positioned herself at the bedside, opposite the attending, and began the rhythm they'd all learned, vital signs called out every 30 seconds, medication ready before it was asked for, the attending's hand steady as surgical steel as he guided the needle toward the pericardial space at the xiphoid process, angling upward and toward the left shoulder at 45 degrees. The ultrasound guided him. The needle penetrated the pericardium with a subtle give, the way a knife parts silk. The syringe filled with blood, dark, venous blood that had pooled around Reeves's heart like an accusation. 50 milliliters drained. The heart monitor's rhythm began to recover. Just slightly. Just enough. 60 milliliters. 80. Margaret watched the numbers climb on the monitor like a prayer answered in beeps and waveforms. Oxygen saturation, 87. 89, 91. Blood pressure rising. 68/45. 72/48. The attending physician was still focused, still calm, but Margaret could see it in the set of his shoulders, relief. The kind of relief that only comes when you pull someone back from the edge. Fluids clearing, he said to no one in particular. Hearts decompressing. I want 2 liters of normal saline wide open, type and cross for 4 units, and get cardiothoracic down here for evaluation. This guy needs to go to the OR as soon as we stabilize him further. His eyes found Margaret's for just a moment. A nod. Not quite a thank you, but close enough. In trauma, close enough was everything. Jenkins moved to the 4 pump. The resident was already on the phone with cardiothoracic. The attending stepped back, his work done, leaving the stabilization to the floor team, the maintenance crew that kept the body running while the surgeons got ready to rebuild it. Margaret stayed. She didn't move. She adjusted the flow rate on the saline, checked the catheter site, repositioned Reeves's head on the pillow so the endotracheal tube wouldn't kink. His pupils were blown, the sedation deep, his body just a series of physiological measurements now, heart rate 118, respiratory rate 18 with the ventilator, oxygen saturation 94%, blood pressure stabilizing at 85/54. Alive. The crisis had passed. The room began to decompress around her. The attending was dictating notes to a recorder. Jenkins was documenting the procedure times. The tech was pulling the ultrasound machine out of the room. And Margaret stood at the bedside, her hand resting on the bed rail next to Reeves's wrist, watching the pulse beneath his pale skin, steady, strong, the pulse of a man who was going to keep breathing. "What are you doing here?" The voice came from the doorway like a shot fired from cover. Dr. Whitfield stood in the ICU entrance, still wearing his street clothes under his white coat, his tie crooked in a way that suggested he'd thrown it on in his car. His eyes fixed on Margaret with the precision of a predator spotting prey. "The code," Margaret said. Her voice didn't waver. "I was nearby. Responded to assist. You're assigned to the lower floors. Graveyard shift." He moved into the room with the kind of deliberate motion that made people instinctively back away. "On the lower floors. In the lower wards. Not the ICU. Not near this patient." He gestured at Reeves with the back of his hand, as if the man was an inconvenience rather than a human being who'd just been pulled from the brink of death. And certainly not hands-on. The attending physician looked up from his notes. Dr. Whitfield, the nurse's assistant, was crucial. Her response time was exceptional. "I'm sure it was." Whitfield's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of someone who'd just realized someone had moved his chess piece. Which is precisely why we need to establish appropriate boundaries. Nurse Walsh has a documented pattern of emotional involvement with patients. It's a patient safety issue. A professional standards issue. He turned to face her directly, his voice dropping to something almost conversational, which was worse than anger, Margaret had learned. Anger was honest. Conversational was calculated. Effective immediately, you're removed from ICU rotations. All ICU rotations. Your access is restricted to the lower acuity wards. It's for the patient's protection. I'm sure you understand." The room had gone quiet. The attending opened his mouth, then closed it. Jenkins was carefully not looking in anyone's direction. The invisible walls of hospital hierarchy were rising, and everyone in that room understood what they meant. A nurse restricted from the ICU was a nurse being slowly erased from the spaces that mattered. A nurse being erased from patient care. A nurse being removed from the one place where she could watch over the man whose name was tattooed on his arm beneath sedation and monitors. Margaret's jaw clenched imperceptibly. Her hands remained steady. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't shatter the careful architecture of her invisibility, nothing to say that wouldn't expose the things that were supposed to stay buried. She simply released the bed rail and turned toward the door. Her face betrayed nothing, not anger, not frustration, not the white-hot fury that lived behind her sternum like a second heartbeat. The composure held. The mask held. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Sergeant Reeves would wake up in a hospital bed in a few hours with a woman in scrubs he'd never seen before, that he'd need someone who understood what it meant to be put back together after being shattered, and Margaret wouldn't be there. That role had been revoked by a man whose only superpower was recognizing that a meticulous nurse with careful hands represented a threat to the empire of fraud he'd spent 6 figures building. She walked down the corridor toward the stairwell, her shoes making no sound on the polished tile. Behind her, Dr. Whitfield was already talking to Jenkins about new protocols for restricted staff access. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby. Somewhere in room 347, a man who didn't know her name was breathing steadily, alive because of hands that would no longer be allowed to touch him. The code had been won. And Margaret had lost. The doors to ICU room 347 burst open at 11:15 p.m. on Saturday. The man who entered was wild-eyed and sweating, a .38 revolver trembling in his grip like a thing alive. His voice came out as a shriek, all desperation and rage. "Fentanyl. Now. I know you got it here. I know you got the good stuff." The nurses at the station froze. The monitors kept their steady rhythm, beep, 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 indifferent to the gun. Margaret was 2 rooms down, checking a post-op dressing. She heard the commotion and moved toward it without thinking, the way water finds the lowest point. Her feet knew the path before her mind had finished processing. Her hands were already moving when she rounded the corner and saw him, the gun, the wild eyes, the way he was advancing toward Sergeant Reeves's bed like a man walking into a fire. Reeves was still sedated, still lost in whatever fog the medications provided, unaware that danger was advancing on him at 10 miles per hour. Margaret saw the geometry of it instantly. Saw the angle of the gun. Saw the distance from the intruder to the fall line. Saw Reeves lying vulnerable, defenseless, a man who couldn't protect himself, a man she'd already carried across 11 kilometers of hell once before. Muscle memory didn't ask permission. It never does. She stepped between the gun and the bed. Just like that. One movement. The way a mother steps between a child and an oncoming car, not brave, not thinking, just inevitable as gravity. Her shoulders were back. Her stance was wide. She didn't put her hands up because raised hands meant surrender, and Margaret Walsh had spent 23 years learning that surrender was a choice you made with your whole body or not at all. "Step back," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. The civilian nurse was gone. What stood in her place was something harder, something forged in desert heat and enemy fire. "You need to lower that weapon." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The man's eyes widened slightly. He'd expected nurses to scream. Expected them to run. He had not expected one to move closer. The gun trembled more violently in his hands, not from fear but from the specific jittering of someone 9 hours into withdrawal, someone whose nervous system was eating itself alive from the inside out. His hands couldn't steady because his hands were no longer his own. "Move," he said. "Move or I put a hole in her." Margaret didn't move. She calculated the distance. Approximately 8 feet. She calculated his reaction time, slow, degraded by chemicals and desperation. She calculated the angle of the weapon, the trajectory, the places on her body that could absorb impact without stopping her from reaching him. Pain was information. Pain was data. And her data was cold and clear as surgical steel. The first bullet came without warning. No countdown. No dramatic pause. Just a crack like lightning splitting wood, and the impact hit her left shoulder like a sledgehammer swung by an angry god. The bullet tore through her trapezius, through the bundle of nerves and muscle that made her arm move. Her shoulder exploded into white noise. She didn't fall. Didn't cry out. Didn't even stumble. What she did was step closer. "You need to leave this room," she said, the same voice, the same command. Blood was already running down her left arm, painting her skin copper red. "Now." He fired again. The second bullet caught her low and left, tore through the soft tissue of her abdomen like a thermal lance cutting through steel. This was the kind of wound that made gravity personal. Her knees wanted to buckle, her vision wanted to darken, her body wanted to lie down and wait for the end. But Margaret's body was not in charge. Something else was. Something that had been forged in war and buried under a pile of anonymous scrubs and careful humility. She stepped closer again. Her hands were steady. The world was sliding sideways, but her hands remained steady as surgical lasers. She was close enough now. The gun was close enough. The intruder's eyes had gone wide with something that might have been fear or might have been confusion. He couldn't understand why the woman with 2 bullets in her was still standing, still advancing, still the thing between him and everyone else in this room. The third bullet came as he finally tried to back away. It caught her hip bone, the femur head, the socket where her leg connected to her trunk, and the bone shattered like tempered glass hitting concrete. The agony was biblical. The agony was knowledge. The agony was the end of physics, the moment when biology stops obeying the rules of motion and simply stops. Her leg collapsed beneath her, and she fell forward across Sergeant Reeves's bed like a shield thrown by the last warrior. She landed on top of him, her body covering his, her arms wrapped around him the way she'd wrapped him 9 years ago when Taliban fire was cutting through the air above them like invisible scissors. Her face was against his chest. Her left arm was useless. Her abdomen was on fire. Her hip was splintered, but her body was still between him and the world. The gun fell. Security came running, 3 officers with tactical vests and faces made of focus, and the intruder dropped to his knees with his hands up because he finally understood that he was not the most dangerous thing in this room. The trembling ones usually are. Margaret stayed exactly where she was. Her eyes were still open. Her breathing was still steady, already shifting into the low automatic rhythm of shock compensation. "Call code blue," she said to the nearest nurse, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell them 3 GSWs on the floor. Tell them I need surgery in." She checked the wall clock with the eye that still worked right, 8 minutes. "And somebody get him to neuro. Sergeant Reeves needs imaging." Always the patient first. Even when you were bleeding out into a hospital mattress like a broken dam. The paramedics arrived with the sound of boots and equipment, and they loaded her onto a stretcher, her own blood pooling beneath the worn combat boots that were still somehow on her feet, the boots she'd kept in her locker all these years, the boots from Bagram, the boots that had carried her 9 kilometers through hell and back. Someone cut them off her feet. Someone else was already calling out her vitals to the OR team. 98/60 and dropping. Her O2 sat 84 on high-flow mask. Heart rate 120, climbing. How many bullets? The trauma surgeon was already moving. 3. Left shoulder, abdomen, right hip. Time down. For minutes, maybe 5. Margaret's eyes were closing. She could feel the morphine hitting her bloodstream like a warm hand, pulling her down into darkness. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Sergeant Reeves, finally awake, his eyes finally clear, watching her with an expression that looked almost like recognition. 2 hours later, Margaret was stitched back together with 17 staples and a level of pain that made breathing a negotiation. 2 hours after that, she was lying in post-op recovery with 3 chest tubes and strict orders to stay flat, keep still, let the machines do the work. 2 hours after that, Dr. Whitfield made his first move. He called board member Harrison from his office at 2:16 a.m. "We have a serious liability issue," Whitfield said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "This nurse, Walsh, she engaged an armed intruder. Unstable behavior. Possible psychiatric history she didn't disclose. The hospital exposed itself today. She's a risk." Harrison, who owed Whitfield for burying a malpractice complaint 2 years earlier, listened. Whitfield was already dialing the references Margaret had provided, the one she'd left from her years of displacement and relocation, and finding what she'd always known he would find, numbers that didn't work, addresses that didn't exist. Ghosts do not leave reliable references. By the time Margaret woke up enough to think, the machinery was already in motion. By the time her fever broke on day 2, the outside investigator was already here, notebook in hand. By the time she'd managed to stand without screaming, the termination paperwork was already signed by 2 of 3 board members. Security walked her out the service entrance at 6:19 a.m. on Monday morning, 2 days after 3 bullets had stitched themselves through her body. She was still bleeding through her bandages. She was still moving like a woman made of broken glass held together by spite. She folded her scrubs into the plastic laundry bag with hands that wouldn't obey her, each movement pulling staples, each movement a small betrayal of the healing she desperately needed. The boots went in last. The worn leather boots with the sole scarred from Bagram and the laces frayed from 100 deployments. The boots that had carried her this far. She held them for a moment in the laundry room, just her and the industrial washers humming their mechanical song, and then she put them in the bag too. She was nobody. She was nothing. She was just a nurse who'd made a mistake and paid the price. That was the story that was written now. She had no idea that the story was about to change. Liam burst through the glass doors of Seattle General at exactly 9:02 a.m. on Monday morning, a shadow box clutched against his chest like a weapon, like a shield, like the truth finally allowed to breathe. 200 soldiers in dress uniforms filed in behind him. Silent. Methodical. The kind of entrance that made the lobby go absolutely still, fluorescent lights suddenly too bright, too harsh, casting hard shadows across tile that had never seen this many boots at once. The shadow box caught the morning light. Inside, unmistakable even from 20 feet away, a navy cross. 2 silver stars. Purple hearts with their distinctive purple ribbon and profile of George Washington. Margaret's medals. The one she'd kept locked in a storage unit in Camden for 18 years, the ones nobody at Seattle General knew existed, the one she'd never mentioned because mentioning them would mean answering questions she was ordered never to answer. A grizzled veteran stepped forward. Grey at the temples. Scar tissue along his left jawline. The security guard who worked nights, who'd always nodded at Margaret in the hallway, who'd been around long enough to recognize what others missed. When he spoke, his voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, low, mechanical, heavy with accumulated weight. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. Navy Special Warfare. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. 3 tours. Bagram Air Base, 2006 through 2009. The lobby froze. Receptionist stopped typing. Dr. Harrison, the board member who'd approved her termination, went the color of wet concrete. A 3-star general in dress blue stepped forward, closing distance like a man moving through water, deliberate and undeniable. General Marcus Thorne. His chest was a geography of service, Pentagon brass, JSOC liaison, the kind of rank that made entire hospitals recalibrate their priorities in real time. He unfolded a document. Classified. The header read Declassified for Heroic Service Recognition in red letters. During Operation Enduring Freedom, 2008, Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh conducted an emergency combat casualty evacuation under sustained Taliban fire in Helmand Province. Subject sustained 3 gunshot wounds during extraction and continued operations despite critical injuries. Citation for gallantry. Citation for extraordinary heroism. He paused. The room held its breath. She carried a wounded combat medic 11 kilometers through hostile territory. Took a round in the back that was meant for that medic. Refused evacuation until both parties reached the LZ. The next voice came from the back of the lobby. Clear. Sudden. Different. She carried me 11 kilometers through Taliban fire. Took a round in the back that was meant for me. Sergeant Danny Reeves stepped forward. But this wasn't the Sergeant Reeves from room 347, the man with vacant eyes and TBI-clouded stare who'd spent 3 months not recognizing the woman who sat beside his bed every shift. This man's eyes were clear. Sharp. Functional. His memory, the doctors would later explain, had returned in fragments over 48 hours following a seizure that somehow reset something fundamental in his neurology. The trauma that had locked him away had suddenly released him. He lifted his left arm. The tattoo caught the light, Margaret in Gothic script, stretched across his forearm, the letters faded but permanent, a soldier's memorial to a woman who'd saved his life twice now. That was Bagram, he said. This is Philadelphia. She did it again. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the doors burst open. FBI. 5 agents in black windbreakers, federal credentials already displayed like playing cards nobody wanted to see. They moved with the precision of people who'd done this before, who knew exactly where they were going, who had a warrant folded in an interior jacket pocket and federal authority behind their eyes. Dr. Charles Whitfield, the lead agent, said. His name was Patterson. He'd spent 6 hours reviewing Margaret's personnel file and the classified records that should never have been in a civilian hospital database. You're under arrest for fraud, falsification of government documents, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Whitfield stood motionless beside the information desk. His face went through a series of expressions, confusion, then anger, then the particular shade of white that comes when a man realizes his entire empire has been built on sand and the tide is coming. The private investigator he'd hired to fabricate Margaret's instability had flipped. The pharmaceutical rep had provided testimony about the kickback arrangement. Margaret's meticulous charting, every single entry, had been subpoenaed and was currently being analyzed by federal auditors who kept finding numbers that didn't match, orders that were inflated by exactly 40%, medication dosages that benefited nobody except the billing department. The handcuffs sounded like coins dropping. Metal against metal. The sound of finality. Dr. Whitfield, you're also being investigated for Medicare fraud in the amount of $2.3 million, conspiracy to defraud private insurers, and conspiracy to falsify government records in the case of a decorated military officer. Pharmacorp has indicated cooperation with federal prosecutors. Whitfield's attorney, a man named Sterling who'd been his friend since undergraduate, began talking immediately, but the words bounced off walls that weren't listening anymore. The board members who'd signed the termination paperwork were already calculating their own legal exposure. Board member Harrison, who'd made the call to the outside investigator, was pulling out his phone. His own attorney, probably. His own plea deal would come later. Margaret watched all of this from a hospital bed on the 5th floor, her third post-operative day, her abdomen wrapped in surgical tape and gauze that smelled like iodine and antiseptic. Liam sat beside her, holding her hand, watching the news on the television as cameras followed Whitfield out of the lobby in handcuffs, flashbulbs popping like distant artillery. Federal charges carry a maximum sentence of 15 years, the news anchor reported. Prosecutors are seeking 6 to 8 years in federal prison. Dr. Whitfield's Pennsylvania medical license has been suspended pending the outcome of a criminal investigation. 6 months later, the sun was bright enough to make Margaret's Navy Cross gleam like it had been polished that morning, which it had been, because ceremony required it, because some things demanded perfection even when perfection was painful. She stood in full dress uniform in front of Seattle General's new VA trauma wing. The ribbon was blue. The building was marble and glass and designed to handle exactly the kind of casualties that Margaret had been trained to save. The ribbon cutting had been scheduled for 2:13 p.m. At 1:55 p.m., 200 soldiers in dress uniform arrived. They didn't file through the lobby this time. They lined the entire front of the hospital, creating an honor corridor that the news cameras would later describe as unprecedented and deeply moving and something nobody had ever seen outside of military funerals. Sergeant Reeves stood at attention. Staff sergeant now, promoted, his promotion paperwork expedited through channels that suddenly cared about recognizing his service. His memory was fully restored. The neurologists called it a medical miracle. Liam knew the truth was simpler. Sometimes people just need the world to stop lying about them before they can remember who they actually are. Margaret cut the ribbon with scissors that felt too light in hands that had carried so much weight. She placed her palm flat against the glass entrance. Behind her, visible through the lobby window, sat a memorial case. Inside that case were her boots. The same one she'd worn through Bagram and Philadelphia both. The leather was still stained with blood, dark, oxidized, permanent. The preservation specialists had asked if she wanted them cleaned. Margaret had said no. Scars tell stories. So do boots. The plaque read, Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, Service, Sacrifice, Silence. Across town, at Riverside Community College, Dr. Whitfield stood in front of a classroom of 23 first-year nursing students, teaching CPR certification for $12.50 per hour. His hand shook slightly as he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic torso that had no pulse, no blood, no consequence. One of the students was recording him on her phone. Another was whispering to her friend about the news story. He could see the recognition in their eyes, the calculation, the knowledge that this man had been important once and now taught dummy CPR for rent money. The plea deal had included 6 years federal prison starting in 3 months. The restitution was for $0.7 million. His wife had filed for divorce when reporters camped outside their mainline mansion asking about the affair. Yes, there had been an affair, with a pharmaceutical rep, with someone who could help him inflate medication orders. Everything had come out. Everything was exposed. But the humiliation of the community college classroom, the humiliation of standing in front of students who whispered and photographed him and didn't take him seriously, the humiliation of teaching a subject he no longer had a license to practice, that was the part that actually broke something in him that the federal charges hadn't touched. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Margaret's son Liam stood beside her in dress navy blues, a Rotk midshipman, no longer ashamed of the mother who kept secrets but proud of the warrior who kept faith. When Margaret placed her hand on the glass case containing her boots, the assembled soldiers didn't applaud. Applause would have been civilian. Instead, they saluted. 200 right hands moving in unison, a gesture of respect that transcended rank and branch and the particular form of damage that comes from seeing the worst of human beings and choosing anyway to give the best of yourself. The ones who have seen the worst, Margaret said quietly, her voice steady as surgical steel, often give the most. In the back row of the honor corridor, a young combat medic stood at attention. He couldn't have been more than 23. Fresh trauma lived in his eyes like someone still learning how to survive it. He'd arrived at Seattle General 3 weeks earlier with a leg wound from a vehicle-borne IED and a psychological injury that didn't have a name yet, just a weight that pressed down on his chest and made breathing feel like a choice he wasn't sure he wanted to make. Margaret's eyes found him. She nodded once. That was all. One nod. But it was a nod that said, I recognize you. I know what you're carrying. I know how to survive this. And when you're ready, we'll do it together. The young medic's hand stopped shaking. Watch what happens when an entire institution has to reckon with the truth. When fraud becomes federal crimes and silence becomes courage. When a woman who was erased gets to stand in full uniform and know that 200 warriors showed up to make sure the world could never deny her again. If this story resonated with you, if you know what it costs to keep faith when nobody else is watching, please like this video and subscribe. The stories that matter most are the ones that get buried first. Let's make sure we keep digging.